The Awkward Giant, written and read by Jana. Enough is enough, shouted Mayor Pipsqueak at the special village meeting, and everybody knew what that meant. The giant was in trouble again, and they were in for a long and heated speech. The villagers met that evening to discuss the last details of the big parade, which was supposed to be happening on the next day, the 1000th anniversary of the Village of Poof. It was to be the biggest celebration in their lives, as they were officially the oldest village in the country, and the preparations had been going on since last year. There was to be food, a raffle, a fair with rides for the children, a dance, local school brass band conducted by Elishka, and exposition of pine cone statues, and of course fireworks. People were coming from all over the country, and even the Queen herself was invited. The villagers were to dine outside at exactly 12 o'clock, and the Queen was to toast the village and its inhabitants during the celebratory meal. Everything needed to be perfect. Mayor Pipsqueak was in an utter state of panic. The giant was going to ruin everything. He is a menace. Last Sunday, he lifted the church with the entire congregation to have a look underneath, because he was searching for his left sock. On Monday, he used Farmer Bray's woolliest sheep to clean his ears, and on Tuesday, his left sock was found in the woods, where 3 local children used it as a tent. And do not make me start on his daily singing practice. The giant had lived in the village of Poof ever since Elishka could remember. He lived on the edge of the woods, far from the others, and yet close enough for him to be able to see the houses. He was as tall as the tallest spruce tree, had a really bad eyesight, and was hopelessly scared of the dark. Elishka was not allowed to come near his house. None of the village children were, but she liked to look out of her window at dusk, to see the flicker of fire in the darkness by the woods, and she would sit perfectly still and listen to his soft, gentle, and sad singing. She could never make out the words, but she could tell that his songs were telling stories she wished she would understand. The villagers didn't like the giant, and Mayor Pipsqueak, well, he could not stand him one little bit. Once he started on all the things that the giant did wrong, he could go on for hours. Enough is enough, he shouted for about the 100th time. The giant has to go. The villagers murmured in agreement. This meant the meeting is over, and everyone was eager to get back home. In reality, there was nothing that the mayor could do about the giant, and everybody knew it. The mayor was simply too small to make the giant leave, and Elishka thought that was good. On the next day, the village was all upside down. The villagers ran around since before dawn, building stalls in the square, putting up the stage for the band. The air smelled of cakes with jam and gingerbread hearts and punch and lemonade. Everything was abuzz. Deep in the woods, the leaves were rustled, and the bushes stirred, and voices whispered about secret plans and royal jewels, and kidnapping and ransom. Evil schemes were being schemed, but only the animals could hear, and they wouldn't tell. On the edge of the woods, the giant was folding up his handkerchief. He washed his face in the pond. He dressed up in his best clothes and stuffed his pockets with honeysuckle to make sure he smelled good. He used Farmer Bray's fence to comb his hair, and he was ready to meet the Queen. In the village, nobody knew of any of this. Lunchtime came, and everything was in its place and ready for the big celebration. The band stood on the stage, ready to play. The people stood around the tables, waiting for the Queen. The food was on the platters, and it was a feast like Elishka had never seen before. The meats and the sides and the sweets and fruits, and in the middle of everything, a huge marzipan cake, big enough for everyone in the village to have a piece. Elishka stood ready on a step in front of the band. And then the signal came, and the queen was coming, and she waved her hands, and the band began to play. The queen appeared and stood up at the head of the table. Everything seemed to be going according to plan. She greeted the villagers, lifted up her glass, and was ready to give her customary speech. Suddenly, a lot of things all seemed to happen at exactly the same time. The first thing that Elishka noticed was the change in Mayor Pipsqueak's color. He turned very red, then very pale, and then he fainted, his face landing in a plate full of artichokes. She turned around and saw two things. A band of ruffians appeared from the woods and rushed towards the gathering with knives in their teeth, axes, and clubs in their hands, and a wild cry of, "Get the queen!" And they were closing in on the gathering by the second. The villagers seemed to have frozen in surprise. At the same time, from a slightly different direction, Elishka could see the towering figure of the giant merrily approaching the village with large clumsy steps, surrounded by whiffs of an unusually sweet scent. Before anyone realized what was happening, both of the uninvited guests crashed the party, both looking to meet the queen. The scoundrels got to her first. "The queen!" they growled. 8 pairs of hands lifted her up and carried her about their heads back towards the woods. "The queen!" the villagers screamed in horror, finally realizing what was happening. "The queen!" the giant exclaimed in delight, finally spotting the shiny crowned figure with his very weak eyes. The queen was waving her now empty glass, trying to knock the scoundrels over the head, but to no avail. She was helpless against all the hands and clubs and axes. The giant took one enormous step, caught up with the ruffians, and picked the queen up between his 2 giant fingers. "Your Majesty," his voice boomed, "welcome to our village." Then he curtsied and stood her up on top of the cake. Then, remembering his manners, he lifted up the bowl of punch and said, "To the queen," and swallowed it down in one big gulp. The ruffians were not going to give up that easily. They rushed back towards the gathering and decided to attack from the stage. They pushed off the brass band and jumped on the stage to get to the queen from behind. And at the same moment, the giant bowed to the queen once again and sat down on the only available spot big enough for him. "This is not very comfortable," he grumbled as he sat on top of 8 ruffians with axes and clubs and a bunch of sharp musical instruments. Then he helped himself to the roast pig, big enough to feed half of the gathering. The villagers were silent. The queen was silent. The band had no instruments to play. And then, on top of the silence, came Elishka's voice. "The giant has saved the queen! Long live the giant!" There was an awkward silence, and then people started cheering and toasting and drinking and eating, and the queen licked her boots covered in marzipan and very unroyally dug into the cake with her hands, as did all the village children. After the feast, the gathering moved to the dance floor, but there was no way for the band to play. "I am sorry, my fellow villagers, but with no music, we are going to have to cancel the dance," announced Mayor Pipsqueak. The sad faces of the townsfolk, however, transformed when from the stage came the sweetest sound. It was the giant, and he was singing a song that Elishka had never heard him singing before. Not sad and dreamy, but joyful and funny and full of smiles. The village cheered for the giant once again, and the party continued until the queen fell over and the villagers fell asleep on the dance floor. There was a terrible mess, which always is the sign that a great time was had by all. Ever since that day, things were not quite the same. The children of the village were allowed to go near the woods. There were no ruffians hiding in the bushes, and the giant, Well, he was still a bit clumsy and still a bit awkward, but he was definitely nothing to be scared of.